I don't have as much responsibility in the real world as I do with making things. So I get to make a lot more work. You know?
How do you feel about that, Jill? That he gets to make more?
I'm oftentimes quite envious. What I'm envious of is Brian's his commitment to his work and his dedication, and it keeps him constantly with his hand in his work. And I'm much more come to the work, step out of the work. So I'm much more like I have to kind of start my relationship to my work in different ways.
Okay, and that's one of the questions I wanted to ask too. Is do you give quite a bit of feedback to each other on your work, or you kind of still work in isolation? And
I think that we talk about our work a lot, you know, other people's as well as our own. And for me, it's a confidence boost. You know, I can Jill, what do you think about that? I like that. Yeah. So
I think we lean on each other a lot. I feel like I lean on him. I don't see it as him leaning on me as much as me providing like my impressions for him, which he's saying is supportive, and of course is going to be supportive. But yeah, I think we definitely the critiques, like this work for me is very new, and I see this as a series, and that's kind of how I kind of come to my work as like teaching and being an administrator of an art program. I am in like start and stop, so I come in and I create a body of work, and then time evolves and I create a body of work. So I feel like his critique was super helpful to me to take risks, and
sure.
It's the same sort of stuff that we do as teachers too. We want to kind of be that person, so it's cool to have somebody right with you that's there that wants to talk about it.
Right. Yeah. In our third In Tandem, a series of artists, we have today with us Jill Odegaard and Brian Wiggins, who are from Allentown, Pennsylvania, with strong connections, of course, to Minnesota. And they are artists that are featured on the back wall here during the month of August.
I'm Jill Odegaard, and I'm originally from Minnesota. Grew up in Moorhead, Minnesota. I currently live in Allentown, Pennsylvania. I teach at a college, Cedar Crest College, and I've lived in Pennsylvania for 21 years. And my connection to art has been through my interest in materials. From the time very young, always kind of dabbling in materials, from mud pies to rainy days, mucking about with the mud, making something out of nothing, and that's really translated into my contemporary work in paper.
Hi, I'm Brian Wiggins, and I primarily paint. I make a lot of paintings on paper, and I make a lot of paintings on canvas. Most of it has to do with color and pattern. That's kind of a simple way to get into the work, and then the patterns are disrupted.
So one of the things that we talk about often is the inviting the viewer to take the time with the work. And when we're looking at this work, it's all non-objective work. It's not referencing a landscape. It's not referencing a still life. It's working off of basic design principles. So to really invite the viewer to spend the time to kind of discover what the work is, to give it the time that it's needed to see the visual relationships that are emerging, or the color patterns that are starting to emerge. And I think that that's a really important aspect of looking at work like this. It's not objective work.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I mean, my palette is probably, with the gouache paintings here, I probably have 70 different tubes of paint. And most of them are different variations of primary colors. And, in the last probably actually since 2020, I've been introducing more secondary colors and as something that I can intermix with the primaries and go back and forth. And I tend to mix the colors together, and then if I'm going to use white, I'll add it in and I'll then put more pigment back into it, you know, so they just don't get desaturated from using white paint, because the frequency of color is a little bit stronger, I guess, than dealing with the value, although the value and the contrast can really drive shape relationships.
Why art? And when did you realize that you were an artist?
It's the realization, I guess. I mean, there's a lot of definitions, but that probably happened when I was around 6 years old, and so went to the Piggly Wiggly grocery store with my mom, and if you got to spend a certain amount of money, you got to pick out an art print, and I got to pick that out, and that pretty much set the stage for me to be an artist. My path hasn't really wavered since then. You know.
Why art? Why do I have art in my life as an artist? For me, it's about finding purpose, being grounded in materials and process. It's a place for me to kind of isolate and be more internal. And I really identified as an artist, I guess, through schooling, and I knew I wanted to be an art major coming right out of high school. I didn't really see myself so much as an artist then. Holding that title is always sort of ambiguous to me. I'm an artist, I'm a teacher, I'm an educator, I'm a lot of things. But so I think ultimately the foundation is that I'm a maker. And for me, being an artist is about being a maker. My place of go-to, if I'm doodling in my sketchbook or thinking about starting a piece, my go-to is the grid.
Okay.
As a structural device, it's a formal device, it's a way to organize, it's a way to create a foundation. And then I tend to, and this is the materials, that I'm working with. Handmade paper has a tendency to be more organic. There's a softness, a tactile quality that I bring in, and I feel like what that infuses is more of my personality and my kind of demeanor, maybe, like a little bit, I like order, I like structure, but I'm kind of disorganized, I'm sort of more casual, and I feel like the paper sort of talks to that part of me, so it's a little bit of a
Yeah.
self-portrait in a
Brian's
way.
nodding quite a bit on that.
I agree, totally. Inspiration, I would say that probably the largest inspiration that I have is understanding the instability of our senses and how we relate to the world, and we assume things to be solid when they're not, or that when there's any disruption to the pattern of what we need to do during the day. I would say that that's probably the most inspiring thing that keeps me working day to day, is trying to figure that out.
Things that inspire my work, I would say, are very much about materials. And so I've been focusing for the last number of years on handmade paper, working with paper pulp. And for me, that process begins from the raw material, manipulating the fiber, if it's from purchased fiber or if it's from fabrics, processing fabrics. So really taking something truly from nothing and bringing it to life in new ways. The versatility of that material has always allowed for a wide range of experimentation. So I'm always finding new paths of communicating through the materials. In terms of influences, what influences the imagery that I work with, I find that I fall deeply back into just the foundations of art, simple things of line, shape, composition, really just that foundation. I learned that as a student. It's what's taught, it's what I teach my students, and how those basic elements can, in and of themselves, communicate if the viewer allows themselves time to experience those things. And so I really fall back on formal compositions, visual relationships, shape, line, gestures, colors to create something very dynamic in something that I kind of can connect to the movement. I see the use of the grid for me as a structural device in my work. Most of my work has that kind of undertone of structure, square formats, the grid, and for me that is something that's very much about organizing the space. And then I bring in my personality of more organic kind of soft textures through the material and the color palette.
I'm sort of the anti-grid in a way, but all those things that Jill said about the grid, I totally agree with them, and it's something you really can't avoid. You live in a grid without even realizing it. There's just lots of different variations to it, and within any piece, everything is contained within its edges. And for my process is to start on the outside edge with just these arbitrary marks. Some of them they don't do that. Make those marks, and by the time I've made 3 or 4 sections of those marks, I have no idea what they're going to do in relation to the next one. Because they shift and change the entire time, and sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, and sometimes there's things that I see, and I'll repeat it in other pieces, and sometimes there's things I'll see and I'll make sure I never do it again. But they seem to stand well on their own, and with the color you can work from the outside in, and when you look at it, you have no sense that that's what you're doing. But the color and the way the lines relate to one another makes it expand outward, and all kinds of things happen.
Interesting.
Without even realizing it, you're in school or whatever, you're attracted to particular types of art.
Right.
And obviously, op art as a type of abstraction was very important to me. At the time I was in school, it was completely dismissed as just kind of being this mode of fashion to go along with the 60s, and it actually predates the 60s quite a bit through psychology. And so there's all these visual studies in psychology that essentially do what pop art of the 60s did. And I found that really intriguing, and it doesn't have so much, some of it doesn't have anything to do with color, or it has to do with shapes, making a shape like a rectangle or a square appear to be irregular, where one is smaller than the other, just by how it's overlaid on the pattern, so it distorts the shape. And form is always kind of thought of as being independent, that there's line and there's shape and there's color, and they all do this, but there's, at some point they collide with one another, so, so yes, X color can be dominant at a particular point, but you can always reverse that just by the amount of space that color takes up, or the intensity in relation to other things, and so they'll expand and contract, based on the scale, the amount of space in a color is within a painting or things like that. And
So process, the whole thing for me about being an artist is about process. And so for me, it's about starting in the studio, working with material and playing around and starting things, and maybe it doesn't evolve into an actual work, but I may have a whole little cluster of little cubes that have been coated with pulp. And then the next time I'm coming into the studio, maybe I see that one of those little cubes has a visual relationship to something else that I'm making. So I think thinking about sort of an intuitive, sort of organic kind of relationship to materials and is part of my process. So like in some of the work, I may spend hours and hours dipping wire, and it's a mundane task, and I don't know where it's going, but I love the texture. So I'm just gonna keep doing it. And then 6 months from now, I may open up this bin and see this fabulous texture that will work in the pieces that I'm working on. So it's, for me, it's everything kind of evolves along the way. And in terms of realizing when a piece is done, that's really one of the harder things. Oftentimes I turn to my partner, my husband, and say, what's going on here? What do you think? So, being willing to get feedback is huge. I think, sometimes as an artist, you're so isolated in your own process that you don't really see fully what's in front of you. And so I think that working in connection to somebody else is helpful in guiding that kind of when things are done.
So the process is with the small things, it's to sit down at a table and paint until I'm finished, and kind of having a model to work in is really important to me, just in terms of having continuity from painting to painting, so that one thing will lead to the next. So I try to minimize lost time as much as possible between the paintings. And working small, you can accomplish your goal of finishing something within sort of the same mindset as when you started. But if I work large and I have to leave for a day or whatever and come back, or for 3 days and then pick up the brush again, I have to reevaluate everything I did in sort of the past tense. And I want to try to avoid that as much as possible. So I work small.
So when you talked about small pieces, would these be small pieces?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So out of curiosity, what kind of time frame does it take you to?
It depends on which one, because they're all different, as you know, because you make things. Things will occur that you don't expect to occur. Some of them will take, say, if I have 5 hours a day to work, some of them will take up to 3 or 4 days.
Okay.
And some will take half that time. I'll finish one in 2.5 hours and just be amazed. I was able to do that.
So if you had a superpower?
X-ray vision. Definitely. X-ray vision.
I had a superpower. Oh man. So right when you said, I'm just going to go off of this. So right when you said that, I envisioned old wood grain for some reason, and my superpower would be to be a sliver of wood and slide into nooks and crannies to be sort of invisible but present at the same time. I don't know where that came from. When we brought the work in to install, he did his work, I did my work, we boxed it up, we drove it out here, unpacked it, and I was just kind of thinking, our work is not the same, so different from each other, right? And then we put it up, and I'm pretty amazed at how, when we were installing it, I was surprised at how my work in relationship to Brian's brought more color out of my work. I was really surprised at that. And so I love that relationship that occurred. And then I was thinking, his work is so hard edge, mine is so much more soft. And then when you put it together, I start to see how soft his become through the transition of color or the pixelation of the color. And so what I've always sort of associated with his work as being really hard edge, it's not. And it's very cool to bring them together to to see that. I mean, I thought it was pretty neat when we hung it up and saw that.